Alright, hey YouTube. This is going to be my first real actual video. It's going to be an instructional how-to video on how to install the Apex Tactical Competition Enhancement Kit if you bought one for your M&P. This is an M&P 9, but it's essentially the same for any caliber. Before I get started, full disclosure, I've never done this before, video-wise, so I don't really know what I'm doing. It's going to be heavily edited, but I have installed this kit before, and it works great. So what I'm actually going to be doing is installing the old parts, or at least showing you what to do. These are all the factory parts that came with the gun. All the Apex parts are already in here. But I had trouble finding like a full video that showed exactly what to do all the way through. I had to piece my way through finding different videos here and there on YouTube. There was no like perfect video that I could watch that walked me through everything, but I did figure it out and it works fine. So here's my attempt at showing you how to install this yourself. It recommends that you get a gunsmith to do it, but it's really not that difficult, and if you want to save some money and just do it yourself, it's not that hard. So here we go. First thing you obviously do when handling a weapon or firearm is check if it's loaded. This is in fact not. So let's just go ahead and disassemble the gun. Okay, so first thing you're going to want to do is take out your striker. We're going to be replacing the striker block and the striker spring, and I actually might put the original striker spring back in here because I was having some light strikes on some primers at the range the other day. I'm not sure if that's something I did or if it's this kit, or if it needs to be broken in. I'm not really sure. So what you're going to want to do with this is, hang on, let me get some punches. Really all that's in here is a plastic tube or nylon tube or something that encloses the striker itself and the striker springs. So I'm sorry, okay. You don't push in like this. You actually get in between that little gap where you can see the striker spring, and you push in towards the barrel here, and then this will pop out pretty easily. And then you can just pull. So once you take this off, sorry, I had to recap on how to get this out. Then you just push down the striker block here, and it should pop out just like that. Pull that out, put this aside. And now this is the spring that we're going to be replacing. And you do that by depressing this plastic piece here. I don't know the name of it. And do it the side of the table maybe. So you pop that off. This is the actual Apex spring here. I'm going to put back on my standard one because I'm not sure that one works so well in terms of consistency and getting the primers to go off. But I can always replace this if I find anything differently. So I put that back on. If you are installing the Apex spring, it actually has a double coil on it at the bottom here, whereas the original does not. And if this is the one you're going to go with, you want to make sure that this is at the bottom here and not this way. You want it at the bottom. But I'm not going to use that for now. So for now, it doesn't really matter with this. They're both the same on either end. You pretty much pop it on the same way you took it off. I'm popping this back on. And there you go. That doesn't look straight. So this is actually on a little bit of a track, and it's pretty obvious the way it goes in. I had it some messed up way that is not correct. It wasn't like that when it was in the gun, but I just did it now. So when you put the spring back on, just make sure it's in that track. This may be one of the reasons you want it done by a gunsmith, but I don't think it's that big of a deal. Put this back on again. And then to put it back in here, I want to make sure that's clear in there, and I wouldn't recommend putting any oil in this track here. It's just meant to be as it is. Again, when you slide it in, you have to depress the striker block here. You have to go all the way in, and it should kind of snap into place, but not really, I guess. So I actually didn't have it all the way pushed down. You want to push down the striker plate and then push this in as far as you can get it, basically. And then it makes putting this last piece back in pretty easy. If I can just finagle this. There you go. And now it's back in as it should. And I always just like to double check that everything is moving around in there as it should be, and that there's tension. And now you have your new striker spring installed, or in my case, you have the standard one installed. Let's see. Next thing we want to do is reinstall or install the new striker block. In the pack here, I have the old one. So I'm pretty sure they give you the striker block and the striker block spring. Not sure what spring it is, but I'll know when I take it out. Barely. Oh no, I think it's this one. Yeah, it's this one. So, the parts you're going to need for this are this long, tiny spring and the new striker block. This is actually the more pain in the ass part of this, is removing this back sight, which involves some hammering. And the part you want to keep in mind is that if you care that much about your sight alignment, to take these measurements on each side, and then when you put it back, you try to get those measurements to line up as you previously measured them. I don't care that much about this right now because I haven't taken the time to sight to center everything. I just put it back to where I thought it was before and basically centered it. And that's good enough for me and what I shoot with. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that off camera because I have a workshop and this isn't where that is. But just so you know, they give you this piece to, once you get this hammered off enough, it's not that hard, but if you haven't removed it before, it can be a little stiff. And then once you get close to where you can see this protruding on the top, you use this to hammer out the rest of it so that when it gets over that, that spring doesn't fly out at you and you lose it. These are really small parts. You don't have to use this, but that's just a little piece of advice. So I'm going to go do that and I'll be right back. I actually decided that I don't feel like doing that because it's just kind of a pain in the ass and I don't feel like moving these sights again. So I'll describe again how you do it. You need a 1/8 Allen wrench pretty sure it's 1/8, to get this screw out to loosen the sight. Then you want to come at it with a hammer or something that isn't going to damage this. If you care too much about it, you can scratch it up if you want, but I wouldn't want to if I could avoid it. Yeah, I don't think mine's too scratched up. You want to hammer it out from this side, and then once you get towards the end, you want to put this in and then hammer this so that the sight comes all the way out and reveals the back part of the striker block. And that's going to pop up just a little bit. There's a little plastic piece that holds this tiny spring in place, and it pushes on the back of that striker plate, or whatever you call it, striker blocker, striker block. Then you just want to replace that spring with the new one, and replace the striker block with the new one. Drop it in, put the spring on top, put the plastic piece on top of that, and then put your sight back on. That's as simple as that. And then once you're done with that, you're done with your slide. Those are all the upgrades. And then you can move on to your frame, which I will get into right now. So the first thing you're going to want to replace is your sear and your sear spring. This is actually not that hard to do. I found it very simple. The harder part is replacing the trigger spring, reset spring. I guess that's the last piece, yeah. So the last part after this will be the reset spring, which does make a big difference, and it's kind of a bitch to replace, but not impossible. So to get this out, your trigger assembly here, whatever you call that, I'm not actually sure. There's one pin on the back here that you just want to punch out with a kind of small punch. And it's going to be a little stiff if you haven't done it before, but for me it wasn't that hard. And I'm going to go do that now in the workshop, and I'll be right back. This one I will actually do for you. Once you do that, you'll have this pin completely out, which was in this hole there, and you put that aside. This little piece, at least for me, it popped out of this place right here. I'm not even sure what this does. It's just like a little piece of plastic on the frame, but it's not hard to put back once you get this big assembly out. I just pop it back in and it's fine. It just comes out when it gets rattled, when the frame gets rattled around a little bit, but it never came out while shooting. Once the slide's on there, it has no place to go, so I wouldn't worry about it, and it probably won't even happen to you. So once you get the pin out, you can just kind of wiggle. You can actually use a punch to kind of pry this out. For the first time, it's going to be a little more stiff than mine is. Mine's pretty loose, and should just pop right out. You might have to lift the trigger bar here up just a little bit. Or you actually might want to pull it with it. Yep, there you go. Then it just pops right out. Put the frame aside. You don't need it. And here's your sear right here. Moves up and down. And to get that out, you need to get this pin here out, which is actually fairly loose and not that hard. You can almost pull it out with your fingers. Yep, you can. So pull that out, put that aside, take your ejector out, don't need that, and now your sear should be completely free and you can just lift it out of here. Hopefully you can see this. And this is the Apex sear, and this is your factory one should be silver. At least mine is. So once you take that out, there's a little, I don't even know what this is, it's just a little pin. I actually used some tweezers to get it out. Let me just get those. So if you get yourself a pair of tweezers or whatever you can find, there's this little pin in here that you can just kind of pluck out. Looks like this. And put that aside. And now there's a little tiny spring in here, the sear spring, that you can also just pull out. And this is the apex spring. Your factory spring should be black and has like a little red tint to it. So I'm just going to go ahead and put that back in. But I just did it for you to see it. And you just got to jiggle it around a little bit until it falls into its slot. Yeah, I think that's in it, yep. And then pop that pin back on top of it. I think that's in there. Yep. And then you just plop your sear on top of that. There's going to be a little lip on the edge there. Not sure what to call that. But that wants to be forward facing this way. Just like that. Hopefully you can see how that's positioned. Looks like that. Then, once that's in there, you have your sear spring and your sear. You slide your ejector in and get that pin that you pulled up from before. And you might have to push on the sear a little bit to get the holes aligned. And then you can just push the pin there through. I'm trying to do this so you can see it, but I can't really see it. Yep, there it is. Okay, so now that pin's in there. That's all fine. I'll push on a little bit just to make sure everything's good. One thing to note is that this actually isn't moving that far forward as it should. I'm in Massachusetts, so my handgun actually has a magazine disconnect. I don't think all models do. And it's this yellow bar here, so if you push it back up, now you can see the sear push forward more, and you can definitely visibly see it going up and down. I would just double check that that is working fine before you put this back in. This needs to be down for me to disassemble the gun. So I'm going to leave it that way. But that sear is installed properly. Then to put it back in the firearm, it really just slides in just as you took it out. You just got to make sure that you put the trigger bar back in the position that you found it, which is just this little slot here. It'll look like this when it's all in there. And that's all. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Takes a little fiddling, but it's not that hard. And it should look like that. There's your trigger. Now, okay, so that bar I showed you before actually wasn't the magazine disconnect. That other bar is, that has a spring on it. This one here. So that was a mistake on that part, but it's essentially the same thing. So in order to see that the sear and the trigger bar is actually installed back properly, just go ahead and put a magazine in there and see that when you pull the trigger, it's moving back and forth, and that you could reset this bar every time you pull it. See what I'm saying? So just double check that. It should be fine. It's not that hard. So now, then you gotta put this pin back in. So I'll go ahead and do that in the workshop. So I got the pin back in. You just want to make sure that it's even on either side, and it's totally fine. The next part is removing this block here. I forget the name of it, and that requires removing two different pins. One of which is going to deactivate your trigger here, and you're actually going to pull this whole trigger assembly out. So to do that, you have these two pins on the end here. One, it's not tapered, but there's two different size holes indicating which way that pin goes in. So you want to go from this side of the firearm to the other and punch out this way. And you might as well do it for the other pin too, even though that doesn't matter. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then once those two pins are removed, you can just pull this block out. And I'll show you that when I do it. One thing I forgot to mention is that you need to take your takedown pin out also. takedown lever, and that just kind of wiggles out, if I'm not mistaken. One thing I'm going to show you in a second is a little piece of metal that fell out when I did it the first time that I'm going to replace this time. That isn't 100% necessary to be in there because the firearm still works without it. It's just a little retaining pin that keeps this not so loose. But when this is all locked up and the slides on here, this can't move regardless. But I will put that up back on here in a second. So you just kind of wiggle this out, and it comes out. And then once you get the taper pin out and the other pin out, you can just pull this block out. You might need to pry it with a punch again. There you go. And just kind of slide, wiggle it out. There you go. Put that aside. Don't need that. And then you just want to lightly pull the your controls out, and then the trigger itself, which this is like all going to be taken apart really, but you can take all this out. Wow, this needs to be cleaned. Aside from this being really dirty, this spring just kind of pops off of the trigger here, or the trigger bar here, and you want to replace it with the other spring in your pack here. And also take this yellow piece out because you're going to need it to put this back in. I'm not going to take that out because this is the actual apex spring, like I said before. So you just go ahead and loop this on. Make sure that the fat end of this spring is facing this way, like this, and set that down. Then you want to get this plastic thing out of here. And this is going to help you put it back in the gun, and you do that by this. Make sure you have your springs the right direction here. Let me just check this. Your controls, I mean. Yeah, they go this way. Okay. So you want to wrap this around here, put the spring. This is all a little finicky, but you should be able to figure it out. Put that back on here. Then you want to line this up, this. Then you want to put this plastic piece through all of these holes. And I'll show you what it looks like after, because you might not be able to see this. Through that little loop in the spring. So that all fits nice. And then through the other end. So now, this should have retention on it now. From the spring, and you see how that yellow piece is in there, right in the middle of everything. That's going to be driven out when we put the pin back in, but it's just there to keep everything in place so that we can get the pin through that loop in the spring. So now we're going to try and put it back in the gun, and this actually took me a few times to get it right. When I first did it, it's probably going to take me a few times now because it's not exactly easy. Or at least for me it wasn't. Maybe for you it will be. But you put your controls and trigger back in. Make sure it's all the way in there. And this block that you took out earlier goes back in. It should just slide right in. The problem is that little plastic piece tends to get in the way of putting that block back in, so you're gonna have to kind of push it directly center in between all this stuff, and make sure there's no space coming out so that you can fit this in. It's really just a pain. Oh, there we go. So now that you have this back in, now if you notice, this pin wasn't that hard to take out. So you should just be able to kind of push this back in. You might need a mallet. Yeah, you're going to need a mallet. So let me go grab that. Just try and get it started. Get it through as many stages as you can. And let me go get that mallet. I'll get something soft to put your frame on. And you should just be able to whack this back into place. Yep. And then that plastic piece will come out the other side. And then just finish getting this pin all the way through. It's not that difficult. Where'd that go? Okay. And I wouldn't lose that plastic piece because if you ever need to do this again for some reason, it comes in handy. So now you have that pin back in. And I forgot to replace this stupid spring, which goes right in there to hold this in place. If yours fell out, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention it. But this kind of just sits there in that block I showed you that comes out and holds your takedown lever in place. I'm going to have to go back and do that again, but for the sake of this video, I'll skip that for now. Then you just go ahead and put this other pin back in. Make sure everything lines up. Should be fine. Yep. Use this. Just get it out of the way. There you go. Now you have that pin back in place. That should be fine. So one thing I forgot to do right here was put this bar back into this here slot there. So I'm gonna have to either take this out or this out and do that again. But in your case, if you did it right, I'm sorry again if I didn't mention that. I'm not a gunsmith. You gotta get this bar back into where it should be, and then you should be done. That's all the pieces, right? Yep. So hopefully that was enough to show you what you should be doing and what it should all look like at the end. Once you get everything back in place and you get the slide back on, it does make a huge difference. My trigger was about a 10-pound trigger when I bought it, which was really hard to pull and kind of a pain. So I got this, and I'd say it reduced it. I don't have a measuring device, but I'd say it reduced it to around 3 or 4 pounds, and it's really nice and crisp. So thanks for watching. If you can, help out this channel as much as you can. I might do more of this stuff in the future. Things that I find that I can't find on YouTube that I can help anyone with, I'll try and do it. Thanks for watching.